My name is Robert, and I'm 45 years old, and I never thought I would have to tell a story like this about my own marriage. When you build a life with someone, you imagine it will be a partnership, two people lifting each other up, supporting one another when things get tough. But what I discovered was that the woman I had built my world around was willing to tear me down, humiliate me, and smear my name just to feed her own ego that I met Melissa when I was in my late 20s. She was smart, beautiful, and had this spark that drew me in. We got married after only 2 years of dating, and for a long while, I truly believed we were happy. I worked steadily in accounting, climbing the ladder, while she focused on teaching, then later shifted to part-time work when our kids were born. Money was never endless, but it was steady. We paid the bills, took a modest vacation once in a while, and I thought we were living the kind of simple, middle-class life most people would envy. But as the years went on, I started noticing a change in her. Melissa always compared us to other couples. Her sister and her wealthy husband, her friends who drove expensive cars or lived in bigger homes. Whenever she scrolled through social media, I could see the envy flicker in her eyes. It was as though our life, though comfortable, wasn't enough for her. She wanted more, and she began resenting me because I wasn't giving her the glamorous lifestyle she thought she deserved. T first, it came out in little comments. If we were at a dinner party and someone mentioned a trip to Europe, she'd laugh and say something like, "Well, Rob can barely afford to take us out of the state." People would chuckle, and I'd force a smile, brushing it off as a harmless joke. But inside, I felt the sting. The truth was, I worked hard to keep us afloat, to make sure the kids had everything they needed, to pay the mortgage on time, to keep food on the table. Her jokes weren't just jokes. They were digs at my pride, my effort, my worth as a man. The real cracks began to show when she started telling her family about her finances, except she twisted the story. She painted me as someone who couldn't manage money, who was always broke, who was one bad month away from bankruptcy. The first time I overheard her telling her mother that I barely kept the lights on, I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't true. We weren't rich, but we weren't struggling like she made it sound. It was like she needed me to look like a failure so she could play the victim of a disappointing marriage. The humiliation started to seep into every corner of my life. At family gatherings, her brothers would pat me on the back with pity, making comments like, "Hang in there, Rob. Things will turn around." At church, I noticed people whispering when we walked in, glancing at me as though I was some poor man scraping by. Even my friends began asking if everything was okay, financially, if I needed help. I realized then that Melissa wasn't just complaining in private. She was telling everyone she could that I was broke. Point one night, after another tense dinner with her family, I confronted her. I asked why she was lying about her finances, why she was dragging my name through the mud. She looked at me coldly and said, "Because it's the truth, Rob. You don't give us the life we deserve. Maybe if you were more ambitious, I wouldn't have to tell people how little we have." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. It wasn't just that she was exaggerating, it was that she believed I was less a man because I wasn't showering her with luxury. The anger boiled in me, but there was also shame. I started second-guessing myself. Was I failing? Was I really not enough? I replayed every late night at the office, every side project I had taken on to bring in a little extra money, every time I'd said no to myself so I could say yes to my family. How could all of that mean nothing to her? The breaking point for me came at a birthday party for one of our neighbors. Melissa had a few glasses of wine, and in front of a circle of people she smirked and said, "Well, Rob would love to buy me something nice, but we're always broke." The group laughed awkwardly, and I felt my face flush hot with embarrassment. I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. I excused myself, went to the bathroom, and stared in the mirror at a man who looked smaller than I'd ever felt before. That was the moment I realized she wasn't going to stop, not unless I made her. From then on, everything between us felt like a cold war. At home, she was distant, dismissive, sometimes outright cruel. Out in public, she leaned into her role as the poor, unlucky wife trapped in a marriage with a man who couldn't provide. And I, meanwhile, started feeling like a stranger in my own life. I couldn't shake the humiliation, the constant sense that no matter what I did, she was dragging my name through the mud for sport. But beneath the shame, a fire was starting to burn. I wasn't broke. I wasn't failing. I had worked hard for everything we had, and I wasn't about to let her rewrite our lives into some sob story that made me the villain. No, I would not let her win like this. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I began to plan. I told myself that one day soon, Melissa would regret every word she had spread about me. One day, she would see that her attempt to shame me was the biggest mistake she ever made. And when that day came, I promised myself I wouldn't hold back. After that night at the neighbor's party, when Melissa announced to a group of people that we were always broke, something inside me shifted. I stopped brushing off her comments as jokes or careless slips. No, these were intentional attacks, little daggers she threw at my pride every chance she got. And as much as I wanted to believe she would eventually stop, the truth was that the humiliation only escalated. IT started creeping into every social gathering we attended. At her sister's housewarming, when people were admiring the new place, Melissa chuckled and said, "Rob could never afford something like this. We're barely holding on to what we have." Everyone laughed politely, but I felt the heat rising in my face. I stood there, drink in hand, forcing a tight smile, while inside I was crumbling. Then at a family barbecue, her uncle offered me advice about finding better work, as if I were some teenager struggling to get his first job. I realized then that her stories about my so-called failures were traveling through her family like wildfire. IT work, too. I began to notice changes. A colleague mentioned, almost jokingly, that he'd heard things were rough at home financially. I froze, because how could he possibly know unless Melissa had told someone who told someone else? I sat at my desk, staring at the computer screen, rage bubbling in my chest. My wife wasn't just damaging me in private circles. She was tarnishing my reputation in the community, maybe even my professional life. The hardest part, though, was the kids. One evening at dinner, my son, who was only 12, asked, "Dad, are we really broke?" My fork clattered against the plate. My heart twisted at the thought of Melissa planting this idea in his mind. I told him gently, "No, buddy, we're not broke. We have a house, food, clothes, everything you need. Don't ever worry about that." But he looked at me with doubt, the kind of doubt that only comes from hearing one parent contradict the other. That hurt more than anything, knowing she was using even our children as an audience for her lies. Like a teen night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every word she had said, every snicker at my expense, every pitying glance I had received from family, friends, and neighbors. I felt stripped of my dignity, as if the years I'd spent working hard, saving responsibly, making sure we never went without, meant absolutely nothing. She was rewriting me into a character I didn't recognize. The broke husband, the failure. And the worst part was, people were starting to believe it, that I tried confronting her again, but it was like talking to a wall. One evening I asked, "Why do you keep saying these things? Why do you keep making me out to be some failure?" She looked up from her glass of wine and smirked. "Because it's true, Rob. Maybe not literally, but you don't give me the life I deserve. People should know what I put up with." Her words stunned me. Not literally? She admitted it wasn't the truth, but she still felt justified in saying it, because in her mind, I wasn't enough. That's when I realized this wasn't just about money. It was about power. She wanted control of the narrative, wanted sympathy, wanted to paint herself as the long-suffering wife chained to a man who couldn't provide. The more she talked, the more I noticed how others looked at her, with pity, with admiration for her supposed resilience. And the more they looked at me like I was a burden. She was feeding off it. That attention gave her something she craved, something I apparently could never give her. That why anger grew, but so did my resolve. I started keeping mental notes of every time she twisted the truth, every lie she told. At a family dinner, she announced that I had maxed out her credit cards, when in reality, I had paid off most of our debt years ago. At a friend's gathering, she said I was behind on the mortgage, when in fact, we were ahead. She didn't just exaggerate. She flat out lied, that I began to see her strategy clearly. She was building a world where she looked like the victim and I looked like the villain. And if I didn't find a way to stop her, that world would eventually swallow me whole. The shame became unbearable. I found myself avoiding social events, making excuses to skip family gatherings because I couldn't stand to hear one more jab, one more lie. But withdrawing only made it worse because then Melissa could tell people, see, he's ashamed. He knows I'm right. One night, after another exhausting argument, I sat alone in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I thought about every sacrifice I had made for this family, every hour I'd spent working overtime, every vacation I'd skipped so we could save money. And I thought about how easily she erased all of it with a few careless words. That was the night I decided I wasn't going to just sit back and take it anymore. If Melissa wanted to drag my name through the mud, then she was going to learn what it felt like when the truth finally came crashing down on her. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew one thing for certain. She would regret making me the butt of her cruel jokes. She would regret trying to build her own image by destroying mine. And when the time came, I would make sure the whole world saw who was really broke, not in money, but in character. The turning point came on an otherwise ordinary Thursday evening. I was sitting at the kitchen table going over some work documents when I overheard Melissa on the phone in the living room. Her voice was low, but sharp, that same tone she used when she wanted to be dramatic. I don't know how much longer I can put up with this, she sighed. Rob can't even cover basic expenses half the time. I'm practically raising these kids on my own. My stomach dropped. I sat frozen, listening, feeling my pulse hammering in my ears. She wasn't just trashing me to her family anymore. She was doing it to her friends, too. And she was exaggerating our lives to the point of fiction. The bills were always paid on time. The kids had everything they needed. We weren't rich, but we weren't scraping by the way she painted it. She was rewriting our marriage into a sob story where she was the hero and I was the failure. Later that night, when she went upstairs, I checked her phone. I hated myself for doing it, but I couldn't take the constant suspicion anymore. What I found made my hands shake with fury. Text messages to her closest friends, to her sister, even to people from our church, all spinning the same narrative. That I was broke, useless, irresponsible, that she was stuck in a loveless marriage with a man who could barely provide. But the most painful part was a message thread with our daughter's soccer coach. She wrote, "If you only knew how hard it is. I have to beg Rob for every penny. Half the time, I can't even get gas money from him." Lies. Pure lies. I had never once refused her money for the kids, never once made her beg for anything essential. My vision blurred with anger, and I had to put the phone down before I threw it against the wall. That night, I lay awake thinking about the life I was living. My wife, the woman I trusted, was deliberately dismantling my reputation piece by piece. She wasn't just embarrassing me in public. She was infecting every corner of my life with poison. And what hurt the most was that people believed her. Why wouldn't they? A man's pride doesn't let him go around defending himself by saying, "I'm not broke, I swear." To everyone else, denial would just look like guilt. The next morning at work, I couldn't concentrate. Numbers blurred on the spreadsheets, my head throbbing with rage and humiliation. During lunch, I confided in my coworker Mark, someone I trusted. I told him about Melissa's lies, about the way she humiliated me in front of others. He listened carefully and then said something that stuck with me. "Rob, she's not just venting, she's controlling the story. And if you don't control it yourself, you'll lose more than your reputation. You'll lose your kids' respect. You'll lose yourself." His words hit me hard. That's when I realized I couldn't just sit back and hope it would blow over. Melissa wasn't going to stop. She had built an identity around my supposed failures, and the only way to stop her was to expose the truth. So I started collecting evidence. Quietly, methodically. I went through our bank statements, our mortgage records, every bill I had paid on time, every debt I had cleared. I built a file, thick, undeniable proof that not only were we not broke, but we were financially stable because of me. I documented the savings accounts I had built for the kids, the retirement fund I had managed without her ever contributing a dime, the extra shifts I had taken over the years to make sure our family never went without a tea the same time. I started noticing things about Melissa that I had ignored before. Shopping bags hidden in the back of the closet. Credit card statements with charges for spa trips, designer handbags, expensive nights out with her friends. The truth became painfully clear. She wasn't angry that we were broke. She was angry that I wouldn't let her spend recklessly. She wanted the appearance of wealth, and when I tried to rein it in, she turned me into the villain. The betrayal cut deeper than I could describe. This wasn't just about lies anymore. It was about years of manipulation, years of her turning her dissatisfaction into my shame. I thought back to all the times I had sat quietly while she made those jokes in public, the times I had smiled through the humiliation just to keep the peace. And I hated myself for it. I had let her walk all over me, and now she was stomping my dignity into the ground. But that self-hatred turned into something else: resolve. For the first time, I stopped thinking about how much it hurt and started thinking about how to fight back. If Melissa wanted to build a reputation on lies, then I would burn those lies down with the truth that I didn't act immediately. I waited. I watched. Every time she made another public jab, every time she twisted the story to someone new, I reminded myself that patience was my weapon. Because when I finally struck back, it wouldn't just be in private. It would be in front of the same people she had used to shame me. Late one night, sitting alone in the quiet of the living room, I made myself a promise. Melissa thought she was untouchable, that she could humiliate me without consequence. But she had underestimated me. She thought I was too quiet, too passive, too beaten down to fight back. She was wrong. And soon enough, she was going to find out just how wrong she was. The opportunity to fight back came sooner than I expected. Melissa's cousin was hosting a big family gathering, the kind where everyone showed up: siblings, uncles, aunts, old friends who might as well have been family. Normally, I dreaded these events because I knew Melissa would use them as her stage, tossing little barbs about my supposed failures while everyone else pretended not to notice. But this time, I walked into that house with a plan and a folder tucked inside my jacket that I intended to use if she tried humiliating me again. Sure enough, it didn't take long. We were all sitting in the living room, people laughing and catching up, when the conversation turned to vacations. Someone mentioned a trip to Italy, and Melissa, without missing a beat, smirked and said, "Well, Rob could never afford something like that. We're always scraping by." The room filled with awkward chuckles, and all eyes shifted to me. My stomach churned, but instead of shrinking back like I usually did, I leaned forward, my voice steady. "Actually," I said, "that's not true. In fact, I think it's time I clear something up." Melissa's smile faltered, but she tried to wave me off. "Oh, Rob, don't start. People know I'm just joking." "No," I said firmly. "You're not joking. You've been telling people for years that I'm broke, that I can't provide, that I'm failing as a husband and father. And I've stayed quiet, thinking it wasn't worth fighting over. But enough is enough." I reached into my jacket, pulled out the folder, and opened it on the coffee table for everyone to see. Bank statements, mortgage records, proof of paid-off debts, savings accounts in both kids' names. "This," I said, my voice shaking with both anger and relief, "is the truth. We are not broke. We never have been. Every bill has been paid, every debt cleared. I've spent years working overtime, saving, sacrificing, making sure this family never went without. And I'm done letting Melissa tell a story that isn't real." The room was silent. I could feel every eye on me, and for the first time, Melissa looked cornered. She stammered, "Rob, this is ridiculous, is it?" I cut in, my voice sharp. I pulled out a credit card statement I had highlighted. "Because here's the truth. While I've been budgeting carefully, Melissa has been spending thousands on handbags, spa trips, and nights out. That's not me failing. That's her pretending we're broke because she can't get everything she wants." Gasps rippled through the room. Her sister leaned forward, eyes wide, and asked, "Melissa, is this true?" Melissa's face went pale, then red, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for the right lie. But no words came. For once, she was speechless. That I pressed on, my anger now fueled by years of humiliation. "You told your family I couldn't pay the mortgage. Here are the receipts, paid months in advance. You told our kids I made you beg for gas money. That's a lie, and you know it. You've been poisoning people against me because you care more about appearances than reality. And I'm done letting you ruin my name." The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. People looked at me differently, not with pity, but with shock, with sympathy, with realization. And they looked at Melissa with something else, disappointment. She tried to recover, her voice shaking. I was just exaggerating. I didn't mean, but her uncle cut her off. Melissa, this is too much. You've been telling us for years that Rob can't handle money. If what he says is true, his voice trailed off, but the message was clear. Melissa grabbed her purse and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I sat there, my hands trembling, my chest heaving, but for the first time in years, I felt free. The truth was out. Later that night, when we were home, she exploded. "How dare you humiliate me in front of my family like that?" she screamed, her face twisted with rage. I looked at her calmly, the exhaustion weighing on me heavier than her anger ever could. "How dare you humiliate me for years? How dare you lie to our children, to our friends, to everyone we know? You wanted to shame me, Melissa. Now you know what it feels like." She spat back, "You'll regret this." But I just shook my head. "No, you will." From that moment on, something shifted in the balance of our marriage. The family who once looked at me with pity now saw the truth. The friends who whispered behind my back now questioned everything Melissa had told them. She lost her power because her lies had been exposed, and I had finally taken control of my own story. IT didn't fix everything. The resentment between us grew like a wildfire, and I knew we were headed towards something bigger, a breaking point that couldn't be avoided. But one thing was certain: Melissa would never again use her lies to define me. And deep down, I could see in her eyes that she knew it too. After that night, when I laid everything bare in front of her family, Melissa never looked at me the same way again. The smug confidence she once carried seemed to crack. But instead of admitting her fault, she grew angrier, more venomous. At home, the silence between us became suffocating, broken only by bitter arguments that ended with her slamming doors or storming out. I had hoped exposing the truth would make her stop, maybe even force her to take a long look at herself. But instead it made her reckless. In the weeks that followed, she tried to spin the narrative again. She told her friends I had ambushed her, that I had twisted the truth to embarrass her. But the damage was already done. The same people who once sympathized with her now kept their distance, uncertain whether to believe her stories. Even her own mother pulled me aside one afternoon and whispered, "Rob, I'm so sorry. We had no idea. She went too far." Hearing that almost made me break down right there. For years I'd been painted as the failure, and finally, someone in her family saw through it. Melissa, however, didn't take losing her audience well. She lashed out more at home. The kids started noticing the tension more than ever. One night, my daughter came into my room, tears in her eyes, and asked, "Daddy, why does Mommy say mean things about you?" That question shattered me. I hugged her tight and whispered, because sometimes people say things they don't mean when they're unhappy. "But you know the truth, sweetheart. You see who I am every day." Still, deep down, I knew the scars Melissa left with her words would linger far longer than I wanted to admit. Eventually, the fights turned to ultimatums. One night, Melissa screamed, "If you think you can turn everyone against me, then I want a divorce. I'm done living like this." For a moment, I just stared at her, exhausted. A divorce had always been my last fear, the thing I wanted to avoid for the kids' sake. But as I looked at her, this woman who had spent years tearing me down, lying about me, humiliating me, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I was free. "If that's what you want," I said quietly, "then let's do it." Her eyes widened. I think she expected me to beg, to plead, to cave like I used to, but I didn't. I was done. The divorce process was ugly, as I knew it would be. She tried to paint me as controlling, tried once again to bring up money, even claimed I hid finances from her. But I had the file. I had years of bank records, receipts, proof that I had been the one holding our family together while she spent recklessly and lied. My lawyer presented it piece by piece, calmly dismantling every accusation she threw at me. At one point during mediation, she broke down crying, claiming she had only said those things because she felt unloved and trapped. But by then, her crocodile tears didn't move anyone. Not me, not the lawyers, not even the mediator. She had built her own cage of lies, and now she was trapped inside it. When the divorce was finalized, I was granted the house and majority custody of the kids. The judge made it clear my stability, my financial responsibility, and my consistent presence in my children's lives outweighed Melissa's theatrics. She got visitation, but her influence had been weakened. For once, the truth stood tall and the lies crumbled. I'll never forget the look on her face the day the ruling came down. It wasn't sadness, it was shock. Genuine shock that her manipulation hadn't worked, that she couldn't bend the world to her narrative anymore. For years, she had convinced herself that she held all the power. But in the end, it was her lies that destroyed her credibility. The weeks after the divorce were strange. The house was quieter, lonelier in some ways, but it was also peaceful. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells. The kids adjusted slowly, asking questions, but I made sure they always knew one thing. I was there for them, and I always would be. I made it my mission to rebuild their trust, to erase every doubt Melissa had planted in their minds about me. One evening, while helping my son with his homework, he looked up at me and said, "Dad, I know you're not broke. You always take care of us." Those words nearly brought me to tears. It was all I needed. Validation, not from Melissa's family, not from neighbors, not even from the court, but from my own children, the ones who mattered most. Melissa, on the other hand, spiraled. Friends drifted away from her, tired of her drama. Family members who once pitted her stopped answering her calls. She had spent so much energy building a lie that when it collapsed, she had nothing left. I didn't celebrate her downfall. It wasn't about revenge anymore. But I couldn't deny there was a grim satisfaction in knowing she finally regretted what she had done. Looking back now, I realized Melissa's biggest mistake wasn't trying to shame me. It was underestimating me. She thought I'd stay silent forever, that I'd let her drag me down while she basked in the sympathy. But she forgot that the truth has a way of surfacing, and when it did, it left her exposed. That I lost a wife, yes, but I gained something far more important. My dignity, my children's trust, and the knowledge that I am stronger than I ever gave myself credit for. When people ask me about that time in my life, I tell them this. My wife tried to shame me by calling me broke, but in the end, the only thing that broke was her mask, and she has been regretting it ever since.